conclusive test by Robert Morris Page, physicist, and these are his qualifications there. Director of Research for Electronics, U.S. Naval Research Laboratory, specialist in precision instrumentation in electronics, administration of research. And he goes into the test of a hypothesis, of any hypothesis. Goes further into the hypothesis, explanation. And he states here on the existence of God. With this brief introduction, let us now turn to the idea of the existence of God and categorize that idea as it is categorized in some minds as an hypothesis. As we turn our attention to the problem of testing that hypothesis, these are the things we find. First, for the purpose of making a valid test, we must assume, for the time being at least, that the hypothesis is true. Whether or not we believe it, we must make the assumption for the purpose of the test. Otherwise, we will be incapable of making a valid test. Second, we must be prepared to accept the testimony of many that our powers of observation are limited to a relatively small portion of all reality. The hypothesis that there is a God includes certain conditions relative to the existence of God which are beyond the province of science to test. The testimony of many is that God is a spirit and as such exists in a realm of reality which is not wholly included in the physical universe, not restricted within 3 spatial dimensions, and not subject to the laws of time as we know them. We must be prepared to recognize that our physical universe, all contained within certain dimensions of space and time, may be only a small part of all reality, just as the surface of the sea is only a small part of all space known to us. Third, assuming that there is a God, we must be prepared to deal seriously with the concept that God is capable of revealing to us information concerning reality beyond our physical universe. Tests as described above have been made by many investigators, including the author. The author has found in the Christian Bible a very large amount of information concerning the spiritual world. This information has come into the Bible through human agencies, that is, through men who wrote what they believed and what they knew to be true. The authenticity of the writings of these men, though the men themselves are human, is established by such things as the prediction of highly significant events far in the future that could be accomplished only through knowledge obtained from a realm which is not subject to the laws of time as we know them. The prediction of future events is not the only evidence, but is given as an example of one type of evidence which is used to establish the authenticity of the testimony of our informers, the men who wrote the Bible. One of the great evidences is a long series of prophecies concerning Jesus the Messiah. These prophecies extend for hundreds of years prior to the birth of Christ. If you look at the Hebrew and the Aramaic, especially the pictographs and the actual language, you'll find that Christ was talked about in Genesis 1:1, and he's talked about right throughout the entire Bible. As he said, it speaks of him from the very beginning, and obviously it speaks of him to the last sentence in Revelations 21 and 22. The historical, go back here. One of the great evidences is a long series of prophecies concerning Jesus the Messiah. These prophecies extend for hundreds of years prior to the birth of Christ. They include a vast amount of detail concerning Christ himself, his nature, and things which he would do when he came, things which to the natural world or to the scientific world remain to this day completely inexplicable. The historical appearance of the Christ is prophesied with the fulfillment of the many things that were prophesied, a fulfillment that is so firmly established historically as to be doubted only by those with little knowledge, has authenticated not only the prophecies concerning him, but also the validity of his teachings when he came. The clinching argument for the validity of our fundamental hypothesis is a personal and private matter, one which arises only in the personal experience of individuals. When one participates in experiments in which all of the implications of the hypothesis as derived from our informers are taken into account, one can observe whether or not the predicted results are actually obtained. When one studies the relationships which can and should exist between man and God, or God and man, when one studies the conditions that man must fulfill to establish these relationships, and when one seriously and wholeheartedly sets about to fulfill those conditions, the achievement of the predicted relationships results with such overwhelming influence in the person's life that there can be no room for doubt in the person's mind. God becomes an intimate personal reality of such nearness and such magnitude that faith grows to the proportions of positive knowledge. And here's a lesson of the Rosebush by Merritt Stanley Congdon, natural scientist and philosopher, and these qualifications. And he goes deep into that. And he ends it by stating, we are observing only the phenomena of the operation of that unseen being who cannot be found by mere scientific seeking, but who can and did manifest himself in human form. So it's talking about God became incarnate, he became flesh. Christ was manifested, as God manifested in flesh, came in human form. He revealed himself in human form. For science is indeed watching God work. The Inescapable Conclusion by John Cleveland Cothran, mathematician and chemist, and these are his qualifications. Lord Kelvin, one of the world's greatest physicists, had made the following significant statement: if you think strongly enough, you will be forced by science to believe in God. This writer then states he must declare himself in full agreement with this statement, because that's a scientist, or what he is, chemist, and that's what he's come to realise. Intelligent and informed consideration of what is presently known about the universe as a whole discloses that it must include at least three major realms of actuality. These three are the material, matter, the intellectual, mind, and the spiritual soul. The contribution from the field of chemistry to this consideration is necessarily limited, since it is only one of many in the symposium. And he goes into detail: how can chemistry influence or verify the proof of God? And he says it goes through laws, neutrons, protons, etc. He explains that. Goes in great detail explaining that. And then he states near the end, thus at some rather definite time the material realm was created, and ever since has been obeying law, not the dictates of chance. Now the material realm not being able to create itself and its governing laws, the act of creation must have been performed by some non-material agent. The stupendous marvels accomplished in that act show that this agent must possess superlative intelligence, an attribute of mind. But to bring mind into action in the material realm, as for example in the practice of medicine and in the field of parapsychology, the exercise of will is required, and this can be exerted only by a person or a being, possibly. Hence, our logical and inescapable conclusion is not only that creation occurred, but that it was brought about according to the plan and will of a person endowed with supreme intelligence, or a being with supreme intelligence and knowledge, omniscience, and the power to bring it about and keep it running according to plan, omnipotence, always and everywhere throughout the universe, omnipresence. That is to say, we accept unhesitantly the fact of the existence of the supreme spiritual being, God, the creator and director of the universe, mentioned in the beginning of this chapter by that Lord Kelvin. The advances that have occurred in science since Lord Kelvin's day would enable him to state more emphatically, or probably strongly, than ever, if you think strongly enough, you will be forced by science to believe in God. And so far, these scientists have realised it. They have proved it. The Answer to the Unanswered Questions by Donald Henry Porter, mathematician and physicist, and his following qualifications. If one could prove that there is a God in the same sense that one proves the theorem of Pythagoras in geometry, then belief in God would be compulsory. That kind of proof this writer believed, does not exist. On the other hand, science is composed in the main of unproved laws or principles. This lack of proof does not prohibit one from using these laws as they might apply to various situations. It is not reasonable to expect proofs in the realm of the supernatural when proofs in the natural are lacking. So what it's talking about is you can't expect proofs from the realm of the supernatural or the supernatural realm, okay, when your own proofs in this natural physical world are lacking. The questions in physics that can be answered best begin with the word how. The present level of achievement in physics does not permit an answer to many questions beginning with the word why. The answer to how questions are probably only approximations to the truth. How two bodies attract each other is well described in Newton's universal law of gravitation. An explanation of why two bodies attract each other does not exist. The force of gravity holds us to the Earth and our Earth in its orbit about the Sun. But then guesswork begins. One theory of the universe requires the law of gravitation to reverse itself and the force to become one of repulsion if the distance between bodies is great enough. There is an accepted law governing the forces between electrically charged bodies. Such charges are known as positive or negative. The law states that the force is one of attraction if the charges are of opposite sign, and of repulsion if of the same sign. The force in any case being directly proportional to the product of the charges and inversely proportional to the square of the distance between them, and so forth. Man's attempt to describe nature falls short when he is dealing with the very large or the very small. It seems that the majority of scientists feel compelled to describe physical phenomena and origins without a God in the picture. Bertrand Russell, the noted British mathematician and philosopher, decided there was no God because he could not answer the question, who made God? There is no doubt that Russell's thought processes went deep and far, but is it reasonable to demand an answer to this question when almost every scientific theory leads to unanswered questions? As for this writer, he places God in the picture. Reason and logic demand it. Speaking of unanswered questions, there are two theories of the universe that are receiving wide acclaim at the present in that time, in that era. But before we take a look at them, let us make some preliminary remarks. And he talks about cosmology and being a study of the general features of our universe, etc., etc., and so forth. And he goes more into it about gravitation, etc., and ends with whatever process of nature is considered, or whatever question of origins is studied. Okay, so he stays up here. Let's start from here. I certainly would recognize, this is a writer saying this, I certainly would recognize God as the creator. Again, God would be in the picture. Whatever process of nature is considered, or whatever question of origins is studied, as a scientist, this writer derived satisfaction only by placing God in the leading role. God is the central figure in every picture. He alone is the answer to the unanswered questions. Let's look at Facts Without Bent or Bias by Edward Luther Kessel, zoologist and entomologist. And there's his qualifications. During recent years, scientific research has been yielding new evidence supporting the traditional philosophical proofs that there is a God. Not that this new evidence was necessary, for the old proofs were more than adequate to convince anyone whose mind was not encysted in a capsule of prejudice. But as one who already believes, this writer welcomes these additions to the evidences for two reasons. One, they give us a clearer concept of some of the attributes of God. Two, this writer was confident that they will open the eyes of many intellectually honest skeptics so that they too will see that there is a God. In late years, a great religious revival had been sweeping across their nation, the US, an upsurge in religious concern which had not bypassed the ecologists but had anastomosed with the intellectual life of their higher institutions of learning, and it is certain that the new scientific evidence which points to the necessity of a creator is playing an important role in this swing to God. Of course, the scientific research which has yielded the evidence was not planned for the purpose of proving the existence of God. The aim of science is to investigate the facts of nature and not to concern itself about the more basic matter of origins. Science deals only with the workings of the mechanism of nature and ignores the fundamental question of where the machine came from. But every man, even the scientist, has something of the philosopher in him, although unfortunately good scientists are not always good philosophers. Some think only vaguely about the matter of origins. Others hold the preposterous view that the universe created itself. Still others say that it is just as easy for them to suppose that the universe has always existed as to believe in a God who has always existed. But the second law of thermodynamics, heat, or the law of entropy, as it is often called, proves the last group wrong. Science clearly shows that the universe could not have existed from all eternity. The law of entropy states that there is a continuous flow of heat from warmer to colder bodies, and that this flow cannot be reversed to pass spontaneously in the opposite direction. Entropy is the ratio of unavailable to available energy, so that it may be said that the entropy of the universe is always increasing. Therefore, the universe is headed for a time when the temperature will be universally uniform, and there will be no more useful energy, and so forth. And he ends saying, and in doing so, it proves the reality of God, for whatever had a beginning did not begin of itself, but demands a prime mover, a creator, a God. Not only do we have scientific proof that the universe has not always existed, but now science has shown that it came into existence in a single great creative explosion which began some 5 billion years ago. Is that the Big Bang? In fact, the universe is still expanding from the centre of its origin. Today, those who will heed the testimony of science must believe in creation, a creation which transcends the laws of nature, for these very laws are themselves a product of creation. And of course, there could have been no such creation without a creator, who must be equated with God. Once he had established the material of nature and the laws of nature to govern its activities, he used this mechanism to continue creation by evolution, evolvement, development. This writer realized full well that the word evolution is contraband in many circles. The mere sound of it causes raised eyebrows. Strange as it may seem, this writer not only understood those good friends but agrees with them. What they have in mind is materialistic, mechanical or mechanistic evolution, between which and creational evolution a sharp distinction should be drawn. If only all scientists would consider the evidence of science here described with the same honesty and lack of prejudice with which they evaluate the results of their own research. If only they would let their intellects rule their emotions, then they would be compelled to acknowledge that there is a God. This is the only conclusion that will fit the facts. To study science with an open mind will bring one to the necessity of first cause, whom we call God. Remember Lord Kelvin? He said science will force you to believe in God. God has been generous to our generation and has blessed our scientific research, it's probably talking about the US, with many discoveries about nature and so forth. Just as an open-minded scientist must heed the evidence and recognise that there must be a God, the non-scientist must likewise heed the evidence and recognise that creational evolution was God's method of creation. Once he had produced the material of the universe and established its laws, creational evolution is the only explanation which correlates all of the evidence which is provided for us in the book of nature. Exegesis in the form of scientific research yields proof of creational evolution from every one of the chapters of this book, that of morphology, physiology, embryology, biochemistry, genetics, paleontology, systematics, zoo, geography, etc. Natural selection is one of the chief mechanisms of evolution, just as evolution is the mechanism of creation. It is one of the great laws of nature, and like all the other laws of science, it acts only as a secondary cause, because it too is a product of God's creation. The species produced through natural selection are just as much created by God as if they had been manufactured by Him. Natural selection in itself cannot create anything. It merely allows or disallows the survival and reproduction of variations in nature. These variations from which natural selection selects result from mutations, changes, which are the products of the laws of genetics, heredity, etc. And these do not behave according to blind chance, as the materialistic evolutionists would have us believe. Mutants are not entirely random or haphazard, as so many have claimed for so long. Take as an example those mutations which determine the size of organs. Recent investigations, or in that time, had shown that most of these mutations result in a reduction in the size of the organs concerned. Natural selection, working through blind chance on random mutations, could reduce only detrimental organs, yet it is a common observation that neutral characters are also reduced. This shows that mutations are not always random, and that the mechanism of evolution is not dependent upon blind chance. We must recognize, therefore, that there is intelligence behind its creation and in the establishment of its laws. We are forced to the conclusion that this mechanism of evolution was designed, and this demands an intelligent designer. Space does not permit the enumeration of other evidences of design in nature, but this writer has encountered many in his own limited research in the field of insect embryology and metamorphosis. The more he studied nature, the more he is impressed with these evidences. The processes and phenomena which he observed in science are indeed manifestations of a supreme intelligence, and evolution merely represents a stage in creation. In spite of the fanatical outbursts from both the camps of fundamentalism and materialism, outbursts which have blinded many honest seekers after the truth on both sides, the conclusion that the species have been produced by an evolutionary process has in itself no negative religious significance. Quite the contrary is true. It is contradictory and illogical for one to accept the reality of evolution and not also accept the reality of God. From the days of the great Augustine in the 4th century to the present, there have been innumerable believers in God who have rejected the idea of creation by manufacture in favour of creation by evolution. In fact, for these, and this writer could count himself among them, evolution has a positive religious importance, leading the completely honest and unprejudiced inquirer directly to God. Again, this writer stated or said that to study science with an open mind brings one to the necessity of a belief in God. Applying the Scientific Method by Walter Oscar Lundberg, physiologist and biochemist. In his qualifications, the professional scientist has one special advantage over others if he will but use it in understanding the reality of God. The fundamental principles on which the methodology of his profession is based are, in essence, an expression of God's existence. Many scientists who do not recognize this point are successful as scientists, and this should not be regarded as anomalous. Success in science depends primarily on an application of accepted methodology and does not require any searching appreciation of its fundamental principles. Failure of some scientists to understand and accept the theistic significance of the underlying principles stems from various factors, only two of which will be mentioned. First, a denial of the existence of God is sometimes an arbitrarily established policy of influential social groups or organizations, or of the state, fear of social consequences or even physical consequences, where atheism is a state creed, discourages any active espousal by the individual of the revelation of God found in nature. Again, even when the minds of men are essentially free from fear, they may not be free from other predisposing prejudices. All too frequently in organized Christianity, there is instilled deeply in young people a concept of God created in the image of man, rather than of man created in the image of God. When such minds are later trained in science, this reversed and limiting anthropomorphic concept gradually becomes more and more incompatible with the rational, inductive attitude of science. Ultimately, when all attempts at reconciliation fail, as they frequently do because they involve rationalization processes that are in themselves inconsistent with the scientific method, the concept of God may be abandoned entirely. The accompanying delusionment and other psychological consequences discourage any thought of embracing a new concept. What is the scientific method, and what are the underlying principles that reveal the existence of God? In brief and oversimplified terms, the following steps will serve the purpose of this discussion. First, the scientist observes and records selected natural phenomena. This may be done without exerting any controls over the phenomena, as in studies of stellar matter and interstellar space, or it may be done with partial controls, as in laboratory experiments. Second, he combines his observations with observations and relationships provided by other scientists before him, and draws conclusions or develops working hypotheses. This involves inductive rather than deductive mental processes, and as much as a conclusion or hypotheses contain more than was actually observed, in essence they are predictions. Finally, if he wishes to test or validate his conclusions, he conducts additional and new observations and determines if these agree with his predictions. In short, the scientific method is founded on orderliness and predictability in natural phenomena. It is precisely this orderliness and predictability that constitute a revelation of God in nature. Order and predictability in the framework of non-existence of God, that is, absence of rationality, is a meaningless contradiction. The ability of man to appreciate orderliness and predictability in nature does not necessarily follow as a consequence of the existence of God, but it is a consequence of the creation of man in God's image. When man abandons the concept of a God created in his image and accepts nature's revelation as evidence of man's creation in God's image, he has reached a threshold where he may begin to perceive God's majesty.